This is a free recording by Cambridge Kutbas, etc. We hope you enjoy and benefit from the content. Also, please consider donating to the new Cambridge Mosque. Please visit cambridgemosqueismoving.org.uk.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Ethics applied to a religious founder possibly is already an anachronism, because ethics as we normally understand it and as received by religious traditions is something that develops as a discipline over hundreds of years, and certainly in the case of Islamic ethics, or ilm al-Akhlaq as it came to be known and integrated into various types of academic curricula, it was something that represented a particular take on the founding documents of the religion, the Qur'an and the Hadith, mediated through a quite strong lens from Aristotle and to some extent Plato. The details of that are complex and lie outside the compass of this evening's talk, but it's as well to bear in mind that what I'm focusing on this evening is not so much what you will find in a classical Muslim textbook of ethics, which is often quite philosophical and programmatic, but rather on the, as it were, primal vision enunciated by the founder of the religion in 7th century Arabia. Another, as it were, preliminary issue that we need to get clear is that the founders of the major world religions did not come as theorists or authors of a systematic blueprint, but rather as inspirational figures who grasped the horns of history and pushed it in a new direction. Probably the most influential individuals in history are the founders of the major world religions, and they did that not through writing something like the Communist Manifesto, something systematic, a manual, a textbook, but rather through being inspirational themselves and answering questions that nobody else was able to answer in their individual milieu. People can't hear. I'm not going to strain my voice further, I'm afraid. We don't have a microphone. They're welcome to move forward. So, when we look at the founding documents of the religion, the Qur'an and the Hadith, the two great scriptures of Islam, what we don't find is a chapter or a book entitled Ethics. Instead, what we have to do is to intuit from explicit and implicit material scattered through the biography of the founder, through the data contained in the revelation of the Qur'an, through the often very intricate and complex processes whereby what is authoritative in the Hadith literature is separated from what is context-bound, a complex hermeneutic process that is still ongoing and has, of course, generated huge differences of opinion and sectarian difference down the Muslim centuries, and try to discern what is the original vision, the élan, the spirit that enabled the religion to do what it did. Whatever interpretation one puts on the fact the Prophet took his people and turned them around in an almost unbelievably short period of time. 23 years, according to the Muslim chronicles, he takes them from being ardent polytheists and turns them into ardent monotheists. He takes them from having no particular belief in life after death, as far as we can discern, to living lives where everything is directed towards the afterlife. He takes them from an essentially tribal, feuding, nomadic culture where there is no overarching law or judges or statutes, and takes them to a very different situation where individuals stand together before a single law, which is the Sharia. So, a tremendous transformation, but what we find it difficult to accept is that this transformation came about simply through a theoretical brilliance. Instead, the real secret for the alchemy which the Prophet seems to have worked on the hearts of his compatriots seems to be a subtler thing, a charisma, a personal quality, something that made people believe in him and hand over the keys to their hearts to him. Without that interpretation, we wouldn't really be able to explain the sudden sea change in the spiritual lives of a very large area that had never been unified before, that had never had monotheistic religion before. A unification that survived the shock of his death and then went out to conquer half of the known world, and most of those places are still Muslim to this day. So clearly, a personality who had a gigantic impact, but not a systematizer, not a theoretician, not an author of manifestos or manuals. And very often in the earliest accounts we have of him, we find interesting statements about how he was the religion. For an essentially pre-literate community, the Qur'an was there basically in people's ears, but it was not something people would physically engage with. It was the Prophet's own personality, his individuality, his khuluq, his character, which appealed to the rough Arabs, people who had a conception of nobility, the romantic image of the nobility of the desert chieftain, and knew what was generosity and what was hospitality and what was compassion and what was justice, and these were passionately defended principles, as we can see from their poetry, and recognized those forms of excellence in him and handed over to him, as I say, the keys to their heart, so that he was able to change their world. So we find these early statements. His widow Aisha, one of his widows, was asked after his death, what was his character like? And she replied, kana khuluquhu al-Qur'an. His character was the Qur'an. If you have to read about it, it's there in the Quranic text. He is the perfect instantiation of the message of the book. To use the fancy modern jargon, it's intertextual. The text and its bearer are two facets of a single phenomenon. The Qur'an is the principles. The Prophet shows how those principles can be transformative in practice. But it's this issue of the khuluq, the character trait, that she is asked about, and she says his character trait is the Qur'an itself. The Qur'an itself has passages in which the Prophet's particular moral excellence is commended. وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, said to have been one of the earliest verses to be revealed. Yours is a tremendous khuluq, or trait of character. And these are two words that we need to remember. Khuluq is a trait of character. Akhlaq means character traits, and eventually becomes the Muslim word for ethics, and it still is. On a certain argument, from a certain perspective in the hadith, we find that the reason for his being sent is to bring about a moral, ethical revolution in his people. Not to bring them political unity, not in the first instance to dictate a law, but in order to change their traits of character. Famous hadith in Tirmidhi, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I am sent only to perfect the noble qualities of character. And as I say, the Arabs knew, or thought they knew, what is a generous human being, karim, somebody who has the qualities of an aristocrat: mildness, generosity, forbearance, wisdom, justice, farsightedness. All of those qualities they already knew, but didn't see too much in practice because the tribes were engaged in endless vendetta. So a moral transformation on that particular understanding of the hadith is the principal thing that he brought about. And that is the key to understanding the political victories, the military victories, the economic transformation, the triumph of the Sharia, the triumph of monotheism. None of those things really would be conceivable but for the fact that there was a moral transformation. The next thing we need to think about is whether in our modern world we can really imaginatively reach back to that particular definition of human excellence. It's an issue now, whether our society has a coherent definition of the good life, or whether instead it's just about, as somebody said recently, the managed pursuit of pleasure. Is that really what we're about? is our new model of what has made us what we are, which is essentially the neo-Darwinian model, something that imposes certain norms upon us, certain expectations, which make ethics rather marginal or even a little bit problematic, extraneous. If we are just the consequence of a billion years of the selfish gene, how do you fit ethics into the human composite when selfishness is essentially what has made us what we are? Natural selection. The weak go to the war, and it's the survival of the fittest in a completely merciless and blind watchmaker's model of what made us the complex entities that we are. That's a problem for the secular mind, and some ingenious solutions have been proposed following Kant and the successors of Kant, trying to provide some kind of constant anchorage for the moral life in the absence of, first of all, Christianity, and then other religions start to feel the chill winds of a secular, scientific, materialist explanation of the human condition as well. But this is important because perhaps the largest single misunderstanding, and hence the largest single intercultural standoff in today's world, is between Westerners who think that they have the correct universals, the Universal Code of Human Rights, the rights of the child, the Geneva Convention, all kinds of impressive statements of what we take to be universal that have emerged on the back of Enlightenment, secular ethical reasoning, pitched against usually Muslim, but not always, but usually Muslim radicals or conservatives or traditionalists who say, actually, those are your universals, but they're not ours. How can you say that these are universal? Do you have a metaphysical anchorage so that you can definitely say that the genders are equal, for instance, or that gay people should have the right to marry? What is the philosophical basis for your ethics? You used to have it when you were Christians, but now we're not quite so sure. And the big culture wars that are taking place within the Muslim world, and also between the Muslim world and the Western world, and sometimes between Muslim communities, say in the UK, who have the desire for things like Sharia courts, and the chattering classes, the liberal establishment, who are anxious about the existence of separate non-liberal modules within a liberal secular democracy. This is a really important conversation, and the reason why it's so stubborn is that each side finds it hard to perceive the other as truly ethical. The West looks like the managed pursuit of pleasure, which is not something that Muslims find particularly inspirational. Whereas the Islamic world looks like puritanical Oliver Cromwell come again, the Taliban, the hijab, the niqab, all kinds of stuff that seems repellent. And despite being in an age of mass communication and a global village, nobody's really talking in a way that the other side can really hear. It's a dialogue of the deaf. Is that how it has to be? Muslims believe values are legislated by God as instantiated in the person of the Holy Prophet, and Westerners are just having a party, and there can't be a communication. It's not as simple as that. Unfortunately, we don't need to be that pessimistic. Because although it's hard to demonstrate in a solid way the real existence of moral universals outside a theistic context, still you can speak of things that are substantively shared. So the idea that murder is wrong is probably shared in all cultures. The idea that coveting your neighbour's wife is wrong is probably shared in all cultures. The idea that you should protect your children is probably shared in all cultures. So we're not talking about two completely different planetary systems talking past each other. We're talking about two different ways of recognizing what is ethical. The Muslim world is struggling to perceive the West as truly ethical, and the Western world is struggling to see why Muslims should be seen as ethical. Muslims are arguing amongst themselves as to exactly how Muslim ethics should be present, particularly in the public or the political spheres. It's one long argument, but it's not really a dialogue of the deaf, because there are certain things that we do tend to agree on. And critically, the basic virtues which the Holy Prophet exemplifies are virtues which, by and large, are universal, are perceived to be such in the great majority of human cultures. Everybody respects courage, everybody respects sacrifice, everybody respects compassion, everybody respects justice, everybody respects challenging tyranny. Those are public virtues, almost secular virtues in a certain sense, that everybody can get along with. And from the point of view of kalam, of Muslim theology, that's kind of a necessary thing to believe. Because after all, if unbelievers were not able, through some congenital defect, to perceive right from wrong, and to perceive the existence of virtue in a saint or a prophet, there would be no logical reason why they should be expected to convert to a revelation once it comes. A revelation is a set of claims, and therefore must presume some moral awareness, some awareness of the good life in those that it seeks to convert. There isn't an absolute gulf between believer and unbeliever, insider and outsider. It's more a series of gradations. However, when we look at the akhlaq, the character traits of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we do find, if we are looking from a perspective that has been shaped or perhaps misshaped by modernity, and modernity is very strange in terms of the historic norms of humanity, we will find certain things that are challenging. And most evidently, the centrality of the principle of submission to God. These are ethical traits which are known to be right because they have a metaphysical referent, not because they're useful on the basis of some kind of golden rule or social contract, but because they're intrinsically right. So we have famous hadith, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, acquire the qualities of God, which seems unlikely or difficult. What it means is you will find moral excellence in the nature of the divine. You won't find it so easily by looking around you amongst other human beings or the animal kingdom or the mineral kingdom, but you will find it in the nature of God. Why is it good to be compassionate? Because God has called himself the compassionate. Why is it good to be just? Because God has called himself the just. Why is it good to be loving? God has called himself the loving. Why is it right to be mild? And there are 99 names for God in the famous hadith in Tirmidhi. And on the back of that, many Muslim ethicists have proposed that the prophetic model exists in order to turn us from self-centeredness, following our own preferences and whims and ego, towards God-centeredness. How? Through conforming to this model of perfection. So that the opposite of all of those things is a demonic quality, and the acceptance of those things is to orient ourselves in harmony with the way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes his creation to be, so that we can become ultimately mirrors to the divine. And there's hadith which indicate that the heart of the believer is a mirror. And if what it is reflecting is something of the perfection of the divine, then that person becomes spectacular, becomes a saint, wali. If the person's heart is completely black and full of passions and envy and lusts and laziness and deadly sins, then the mirror's not going to function, and instead you just get the mirror, you get our unregenerate humanity. And most of us are somewhere between the two. So the process of knowing, rather than just hearing about God or theologizing about God, but knowing God, reflecting God, engaging with God, for sure, yaqeen, is the process of acquiring something of the mirror-like luminescence of the prophetic heart, which is not of this world because it's to do with the ruh, which is min amri rabbi, of the command of my Lord. And activating that within us is what turns us from people who are just doing religion the way some other people might do origami or support Fulham, but turns it into something that is an ontological program of self-transformation, so that one can know, genuinely know, rather than just experience God through hearsay or various probably inadequate forms of logical and philosophical deduction. That's the basic project, and hence things like the early incident in the Prophet's career. When he's young, his mother's still alive, and he's in the desert, and some kids come to his wet nurse saying somebody's attacked Muhammad, and he's probably 2 or 3 at the time, a toddler. They've attacked him and they've opened his chest. And when she goes, she sees that the child is fine, there's no sign of blood or a wound, but what has happened, according to this description of the kids, is that the angels have come, they've opened his chest, they've washed his heart. And the purity of the prophetic heart is the essence of Islamic akhlaq. Because akhlaq, character traits, are to do with what is within us. Just to go through the motions is not to have a good trait of character. To have a good trait of character is sincerely and spontaneously to produce beautiful actions in a constant way. To do it occasionally is not to have a good character. To do it because you're pretending is not to have a good character. Character is an inward action. And hence, one reason why we use this word akhlaq is because it is to do with khalq, to do with creation. It's to do with one's inward nature. And some of it is, although this is alarming to some ethicists, kind of predetermined. It is to do with the kind of genes that you have, and there are certain aspects of one's character that are hereditary. And this is a problem now for the insurers, apparently. If some families produce a lot of bad drivers, do you, as an insurance company, up the premium for that family? Do judges impose a lesser sentence on somebody whose whole family has been alcoholics and committed similar crimes? This is an issue for ethicists nowadays, and nobody's quite sure what to do about it. But genetic science has certainly made us aware of the fact that there's certain things that are innate rather than acquired. This is what we mean when we speak of akhlaq as being to do with an inward disposition and predisposition. However, it's not all predestination, because there are many things that we can learn, and bad character traits can, with a lot of hard work, be overcome and replaced with good ones. But in the case of the Holy Prophet, and it's connected to that mysterious incident of the washing of his heart as an infant, there is no growth into status as a fully reflective, perfected, saint-like human being. It's there from the beginning, and this is why one of his first titles, even before he becomes a prophet, is Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Because when he's buying and selling in Mecca and leading Khadija's caravans up to Syria, everybody knows that he doesn't shortchange them and that he's a responsible handler of their goods. But still, to get back to my point, we need to struggle with this, because even as Muslims, very often we tend to adopt a kind of utilitarian, ends-oriented assessment of ethics. We tend to judge a lot of our institutions on the basis of what we can see them leading to. So with hijab, for instance, we want all kinds of arguments, and it's legitimate to want arguments to explain exactly why hijab is beneficial for society and for the individual. But the ultimate principle is that it's in divine revelation that it is instantiated. That the Muslim ultimately is the one who submits and surrenders and accepts. Sami'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey. That the commandments are divinely determined. But as I said earlier, the ethics of religion are things that more often than not can be universally recognized, and there is a language which Muslims can speak to others to explain why Muslim women wear their hijab, and why. Often these questions are asked, and Muslims have the responsibility to try and find a secular explanation, if that's the word, to try and make these institutions less outrageous to increasingly hostile neighbours. We have niqab bans in increasing numbers of European countries, as this kind of coercive liberalism really bites. It's illegal to pray on the streets of Paris now. It's becoming more and more tight in liberal societies, largely because Muslims have not given, as it were, secular reasons where they can be found to explain and justify their practices, because in modern Europe, in the public square, religious reasons don't count. They can't be heard. So we have to adopt this Sharia approach of al-asl al-ta'lil. The basis in Islamic law is to identify the reasons. There is a reason for everything, unless it's a form of worship. Why do we pray 5 times a day rather than 7? You can't really find a reason for that. It's outside the realm of reason. But in our social networks, which is based on our idea of ethics, of akhlaq, there is a reason that we have to strive to locate, and particularly those of us who are living in increasingly dangerous liberal societies. I was just in Norway, where things are really scary because the far-right party is the strongest party now in the polls in Norway. We really need to get our act together and explain the akhlaq of the religion. We need to be able to give reasons wherever we can find them. Other things to do with the particular spirit or the ethos, the élan of the prophetic person. What kind of a man was he? As well as this conventional list of virtues, heroic virtues, restraint, justice, familiar universals, is that there is in the Muslim idea of human excellence a certain introspection born of the consciousness of the omnipotence and the inevitability of the divine decree that expresses itself in a very considerable public modesty and sobriety. Earlier today I was talking about the hadith, لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاءِ. Every religion has a particular trait of quality, a particular characteristic, and that of Islam is modesty, or haya. It doesn't just mean female modesty, although the hijab is the female expression for that, and that is something for which Muslims are known, but it applies to men also. And to understand the particular quality of the prophetic character, you have to understand how he is the warrior, the public figure who changes his obstinate people. But at the same time, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أشد حياء من البكر في خدرها. Somebody said, the Holy Prophet, God bless him, was shyer than a virgin in her tent, which presumably is pretty shy. What does that mean? He would look down. He would constantly be denying extravagant praise that was directed at him. لا تطروني وإذا رأيتم المداحين فرموا في وجوههم التراب. Lots of hadith about people shouldn't praise each other to excess, and don't praise me. I'm just the son of a woman of Quraysh who used to eat dried meat. There's a certain self-abnegation there, despite the magnificence of what he was doing and what everybody could see that he was doing, which to the modern set of universals is strange, because we don't really do modesty in the modern world. Try and apply the virtue of modesty when you write your CV. You won't get very far, because the modern world is about projecting yourself, exaggerating, showing your virtues, let it all hang out. It's individualism, it's the self. That's all there is. They're just human selves. And that requires some thinking about. And it's one reason why people in the West often struggle with the idea of hijab. Why do they want to be modest? What's modesty? Still, however, people have that sense. It is part of the fitrah, because there is still, in the great majority of people, unease about public immodesty. Recently, well, it wasn't quite as cold as this, a few months ago, I was walking down Green Street in central Cambridge, and this man, how shall I describe him, well-nourished, walked past me in his birthday suit, apparently going about his business, but not wearing a stitch of clothing. And the passers-by either did the very English thing of pretending that nothing at all was wrong, or they were flipping out. But the point is, despite everything, the secularity, the materialism, the pornography, the post-watershed weirdness, we're still not comfortable with that. It's even illegal. We still have in our laws, despite our secularity, an unease about certain flagrant forms of immodesty. So again, this is Muslims speaking a universal language. It's not that non-Muslims can't figure out the hijab ever. They do have resources for understanding public modesty, and there is a sense in which women flaunting themselves too much is perhaps not quite right, although it might be nice to look at, but it's somehow ethically problematic. And that's been an argument in the feminist movement in particular. They've written interesting things about about that. There is a common language. So when we say modesty, self-deprecation, lowering the gaze, being centered, not letting it all hang out, not being conspicuous, this is one of the key prophetic qualities which I think we can help people to understand. Another potentially strange obstacle is holy poverty, the faqr. Modern world doesn't do that. One thing that the politicians haven't told us to get us used to the fact that the bankers have plunged us into recession is to rediscover the virtue of holy poverty. I haven't heard Cameron telling us that that might be a good way of dealing with this situation. Poverty is just bad in the modern world. You want more stuff so you can buy more stuff, and growth is what helps the government to stand or fall. But poverty as a virtue, but he says, al-faqru fakhri. Poverty is my pride. He sleeps on a kind of piece of rush matting, and when he gets up, they see marks on his shoulder, and they say, shouldn't we put something down, because the kings of Persia and Byzantium sleep on comfortable things. And he says, what have I to do with this world? My likeness in this world is that of a traveller who shades for a while beneath a tree and then moves on. It's not that he's kind of anti-world, he just sees it in proportion. We're just passing through. And we all know the inevitability of death, although, again, it's not something our culture invites us frequently to reflect upon. It's seen as a calamity, necessarily in a materialistic world, but not for the believer. Tuhfatul mu'minul maut. The precious gift to the believer is death. Everybody says, that's really morbid. But for a religious ethos is, of course, it's travelling to meet the beloved. One doesn't want to be late for that, and the time is at the beloved's determination. And the believer generally believes that al-akhiratu khayrun laka min al-ula. As the Qur'an says, the afterlife's better for you than this first life, speaking specifically to the Prophet. So a complete absence of fear of death, which, again, in the modern world is hard to imagine or to empathise with. But as a result, he's just passing through the world and he's not really interested in stuff. He's just enjoying it for a while. He's in the shade, but he's more interested in the journey, because the journey is inescapable. So when he dies, there's basically nothing in his house other than this little pitcher and the thing that he sleeps on, and his suit of armour even is in hock. He's pawned it with a local Jewish family. Poverty. And he used to pray, Allahumma ij'al rizqa ala Muhammadin quta. Make the provisions, the food with which the family of Muhammad subsists, to be just enough for the day. And at the end of the day, he wouldn't get to sleep if there was still a coin in his house. He would go out and give it to somebody. لا يبيت في بيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم درهم ولا دينار. No gold or silver coin would spend the night in the house of God's messenger. And that, again, to us, with our pension plans and our mortgage repayments and our income projections, seems very strange. Qisar al-amal, one of his key virtues, short hopes. Don't plan for the far future. Allah will take care of the far future. Those plans will probably go awry anyway. Pension plan might go bust. Who knows? You might die. Don't fret about 20 years down the line. It's the moment that's alive. The future is not real. The future is not in your hands. And this focusing on the moment, being Ibn al-Waqt, son of the moment, is very important for subsequent Islamic spirituality. Too often we daydream. We think, if only I'd caught the bus, if only I'd woken up on time, if only I'd written that essay, if only I'd not missed my supervision. We spend a lot of time thinking about what might have been. But the past is there, you can't change the past, but we dream about what is futile. If only I'd done this, if only I'd married her, if only blah blah. We spend a lot of time on that. And we spend a lot of time gossiping to each other about things that we can't change. And then we dream about the future. This is tul al-amal, to have a long hope, like the story in the Arabian Nights of the guy who has his legacy, which he spends on a few glass bottles, and he sits back in the souk, and he just thinks, of these bottles, I'll buy more bottles, and then I'll have a big bottle shop, and then I'll be able to marry a beautiful woman, and then I'll be able to compete with the caliph, and he daydreams, and he goes to sleep, and eventually he kicks in his dream, and of course the bottles are broken. And we do a lot of daydreaming. We live in the future, but the future isn't real. We think about, wouldn't it be nice? Take a holiday there, do this, do that. If only, sometimes we fantasize about completely impossible things. If only I were married to some film star or other. That's just our nature, but that's unreal, and that's a waste of our time, because it's a fantasy. And Islamic spirituality is always based on alertness, hudur, attentiveness to the moment, because the moment is all that's real. The past you can't do anything about, and you can't reach it. The future will come, but don't try and manipulate it now. It's the present that makes the difference. So he says startling things, like the believer is like the bird. The believer who trusts in God is like the birds. تَغْدُو خِمَاصًا وَتَرْجِعْ بِطَانًا. In the morning they go out hungry, in the evening they come back full. And this is a spiritual virtue of resignation, of detachment, of reliance, that has a place in traditional Christian spirituality and Buddhist spirituality. Everybody used to do that, but now it's hard for us. And we really fret a lot about future possible financial misfortunes because we have very little tawakkul, very little reliance, and we suffer because of things that aren't real. Whereas the prophetic model is to be aware of the moment and to behave as you should in that moment, knowing that the future is in God's hands. And you might say, that sounds irresponsible, but look at how it worked for him. Was he planning, in 30 years' time, such and such a caliph is going to be conquering Central Asia, and then if we do this, we can... No, there was none of that. There was getting things right in the moment, and God will take care of the future. There's a deep wisdom in that, because even the smartest social scientists down the road can't predict the future. The politicians are always saying, what will be the oil price predictions for the next 30 years? What will happen to Islamic fundamentalism? None of their predictions have worked out anyway. How many of them predicted the fall of Marxism and the collapse of the Iron Curtain? Not too many. If you look at the textbooks that they were writing in the 1980s, they didn't foresee that. How many of them foresaw the rise of Al-Qaeda, global fundamentalism 20, 30 years ago? None of them, really. So that's a lesson. We don't have any predictive abilities. Let's not worry about what is in the future. And part of the prophetic way, therefore, is the way of happiness through a complete, responsible embrace of the moment, of the waqt, and not daydreaming. And this is why, where the Qur'an speaks about what you might call sainthood, or the awliya, those who are literally the friends, those who are close to the Creator, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. There is no fear upon them, neither do they grieve. That's precisely how the Prophet was. Because that's about the future and the past. Khawf, fear, is what might happen down the road. Freaking out about the future of whatever. And huzn, sadness, is about what's happened in the past. The saint accepts the past as being God's decree and immutable. Don't lose sleep over it. The future is in God's hands. Your responsibility is to deal with your current ethical situation, your current reality. And the future will be something probably completely unexpected. That's important to the traditional Muslim ethic. Tark al-tadbir, not being too concerned to dispose the future, because the future is not yours to dispose. And we all have to do that sometimes, because many of our key decisions are about taking a leap into the unknown. Who knew exactly what the consequence of the hijrah would be? Holy Prophet and Abu Bakr are alone in the desert. They've been ejected from their own city. Medina is in a state of civil war. The whole of Arabia basically is still pagan and people are trying to kill them. But they took that leap into the unknown with complete trust. The Qur'an says that he said to his companion, the Prophet said to Abu Bakr, "La tahzan, inna Allah ma'ana." They're in the cave and it's dark. They can't even strike a light because the Quraysh are going to kill them. They've been chased out of their own home. They've got 2 weeks of journey through the trackless desert with the posses of Quraysh trying to overcome them, and everything seems to be pretty dark. La tahzan, inna Allah ma'ana. Do not fear, because God is with us. And that's the deepest wisdom of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Lord of history. We need to rely on His good providence. He is the one who determines the future. We go through certain motions because we are required to go through certain motions, but we do them for the sake of the present, not the future. We don't fantasize about what the long-term repercussions of our actions might be, except in some very general and deliberative sense. What counts is whether they are compliant with God's wishes in the Sunnah and the Sharia now. And if we sort out our present, the future will be benign, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has indicated that وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. If you have iman, faithful, trusting acceptance of the reality of the divine disposition of affairs, you will be the uppermost. And that's what they discovered on the Hijrah. And often we need to take a leap into the unknown, and often there's serious life decisions that have us freaking out. Should I marry him? He's got a car, but my mum doesn't like him, and maybe he's going to be difficult, and worry. What you have to be careful, but that's part of being attentive in the moment. Don't try and guess what the relationship will be like in 10 years, because it's never what you think it will be. It might be a lot better, it might be a lot worse, but you don't know the ghaib, you don't know the future. The believer is the one who seizes the moment and acts on the basis of what guidance the Sunnah and the Sharia have given him for that particular moment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of the longer term. And very often people who think that they've got the perfect partner, for instance, in marriage, and they've checked him out completely, and hey, he's been married 3 times already, and so I know, I've talked to his ex-wives and they say he was a really great guy, so I think I've got it sorted. Turns out completely differently. Whereas somebody who goes into a marriage just out of tawakkul, saying, this is the sunnah, this is what I'm going to do, if it doesn't work out, talaq is halal. Those situations often, in a striking way, can end up being very strong marriages. And often we find people holding back because of this tadbir, this anxiety about the future. And a lot of problems result from that. But that has to go hand in hand with the basic prophetic akhlaq, which is that the nafs is the enemy. أَعْدَى عَدُوِّكَ نَفْسُكَ الَّتِي بَيْنَ جَنْبَيْكَ. Your greatest enemy is yourself, the ego, which is within yourself. And we all know that. When we look at the catastrophes that we get ourselves into, it's because we've been cutting corners in various ways. And this is a kind of language that we can speak with modernity, but sometimes it isn't. Because modernity doesn't have a very clear way of distinguishing between spirit and soul. They even find that differentiation difficult. The idea of a lower self and a higher self. But for us, this is axiomatic. And this process of takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah, adorn yourself with the character traits of the Almighty, is precisely about turning away from injustice, lack of compassion, lack of love, and turning towards their alternatives, and thereby opening up the ruh, the spirit. There's so many things one could mention. I have to stop fairly soon. But another thing that is significant, that does actually make a lot of sense to many in a contemporary context, is the idea of our belongingness to the natural order. That Islam is the religion of fitra. he says, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, kullu mawludin yuladu ala al-fitra. Every baby is born according to the fitra, the sound natural disposition. Not in a state of sinful alienation from grace, but in nature, which is nothing other than a manifestation of the divine qualities. And there is something about the experience of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina which indicates a deep engagement with the natural world. So part of the Muslim way is precisely marriage. Even though overcoming the ego is important, that doesn't take place in the context of renunciation in a monastic setting, as in many forms of Buddhism or Christianity. Instead, it takes the form of working through the issues in the context of what is a natural situation, the situation of marriage and procreation. النكاح سنتي فمن رغب عن سنتي فليس مني. Marriage is my sunnah, is my way. Whoever chooses something other than my way is not of us, is not one of us, is not of me. And this also leads on to a sense of belongingness to other orders of the natural world. And this is a neglected aspect of the sunnah. But there are so many hadith, an amazing number of hadith, which indicate how he was, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, not just with his Lord and the angels, but with animals. So I thought I'd pull out a few of these hadith. نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن أن يتخذ شيء فيه روح غرضا. The ancient Arabs used to like archery. They would sometimes, if they wanted to kill a domestic animal, a sheep or a goat or a camel, use it as a target for their arrows. And this was prohibited by the Prophet, who forbade taking anything that has a ruh, a spirit, to be a target, unless it's an animal that you're specifically hunting, of course, in the desert. The Prophet passed by a man who was pulling a sheep along by the ears, and he said, "Leave its ears alone and take its shoulders." The Prophet saw a man putting his foot on the head of a sheep while sharpening his blade, and he said, "Do you want to kill it more than once?" In other words, you're scaring the animal before the slaughtering takes place. The blade has to be hidden from the animal. There's a prohibition on killing animals by fire, even of insects. قال ابن مسعود مررنا بقرية نمل قد أحرقت فغضب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقال إنه لا ينبغي لبشر أن يعذب بعذاب الله. We were once going past an anthill which had been burnt, and the Prophet became angry and said it's not right for human beings to punish with God's punishment. The famous incident in which the Holy Prophet ﷺ is in Medina and he hears an uproar, and he finds out that what's happened is that somebody's camel has got out of control, it's running amok, and nobody can go into its enclosure to calm it down or to put a halter on it. Camel's a big, dangerous beast. And the Holy Prophet goes in. They tell him not to, but he goes in. And he puts his hand on the snout of the animal and looks into its eyes, and Hadat, the she-camel, calms and is still. And then he tells them, this camel tells me that it's been given too much to carry. And the owner of the camel acknowledges this and bursts into tears and promises that from that time onwards the camel will have no work to do whatsoever. Large number of hadiths about the Prophet's engagement with the animal kingdom, which is significant in the context of Islam because of its status as Din al-Fitra, and the Prophet as very much part of the natural world, emphasizing humanity's engagement with and integrality to the natural world, is something that is key to Islamic ethics. And you find, for instance, some of the most beautiful stories of the saints in Islamic civilization are about kindness to animals, a very characteristic feature of our civilization. Ahmad al-Rifa'i, radiallahu an, in the 12th century, famous for many things which were deliberately prophetic things. So the Prophet used to fix his own shoes, he would fix his own shoes. The Prophet used to cook for his family, he would cook for his family. Not a lot of ulama, as far as I can tell, would do those bits of the sunnah, but he was sure that he would do them. Kana fi mihnati ahli. Aisha was asked what he used to do at home, and he said he used to serve his family. He would sweep the house and cut meat and do things like that. Ahmad al-Rifa'i actually followed that sunnah. But another thing he used to do was to follow the sunnah of Ayadat al-Marid, visiting the sick, and he used to wash the clothes of the sick and stay with them, including lepers and plague victims and other people who were regarded as scary and contagious. But he had a particular fondness for animals, and his house was seldom void of several sick animals who he would find on the streets in Iraq, bring them to his house and try and nurse them back to health. On one occasion, according to all of his biographers, he spent 40 days in the desert because there he'd found a dog with a skin disease, and he said he didn't want to meet God having ignored the suffering of that creature. And that's Sidi Ahmad al-Rifa'i. That's one of the ways in which he becomes a great wali, a great saint, as well as being a great scholar of fiqh and sharia. So I'd like to close on that note in order to indicate, as it were, that this is a transferable skill, the extraordinary transformation that he brings about in the character of his people who really certainly weren't into animal rights. The pagan Arabs would quite happily cut the leg off a sheep and eat it, because if the sheep stayed alive, then they could cut another leg off in a few days, or they would drink the blood from the side of a camel. All of those things were forbidden by the Holy Prophet, to the consternation of the rough Arabs. That this transformation actually caught on and produced generation after generation of saints who were saints in that they found the particular genius of the prophetic spirit, which is the essence of Islam itself, belongingness to the natural world while being completely focused on the providence of God, inspirational. And that, of course, means us as well. We have to follow suit. And all of these are things that we can make sense of and make use of, even though they're very unmodern in many ways. Modesty, as I said, not a modern virtue. Humility, overcoming the ego. These are not... Who in the University of Cambridge becomes a professor by overcoming the ego, for instance? I'm not sure that that's ever happened. We have to be very countercultural in this and recognise that it is on the basis of excellence of character that we'll be judged as people and as peoples, rather than through our ability to make our way in the kind of neo-Darwinian dog-eat-dog world of the modern workplace. And that sometimes entails very significant sacrifices, but the Holy Prophet ﷺ was the first to make sacrifices for the sake of his Lord, and that is why, final thought, nobody smiled more than he did. The hadith of Ma'bad, people used to go to see the Prophet just to see him smile and to look at his face. That's the fruit, the consequence of a life lived for God in a state of complete inward and outward balance. The consequence is happiness. At this point, I think I have to shut up. You've been kindly sending me notes, but inshallah, is the idea that we have questions now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Firstly, I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Winter, for that insightful talk. Now we'll have some time for some questions, so please don't hesitate to ask. If time permits, we'll try and get round to as many people as possible. So ask any questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yep, okay.
Yeah, on this idea of the goodness of the present, how do you fit that in with this idea of balance and moderation? I mean, you can't just ignore the risk of what's coming in the future, right? How do you balance this attention to the present and to the future?
One obviously has to, as a morally significant actor, pay attention to possible consequences, but ultimately one is to be judged on the basis of one's Sharia compliance in the moment, rather than the actual outcome of one's actions. One is judged for one's intention rather than the outcome of what we do. And my sense is that too many people nowadays are dreaming about the future or stressing out about the future and ignoring the present, or moving sideways into some cyber world of computer games and becoming completely isolated from the real world. And the modern world is a time of daydreaming. So one does engage in a certain kind of tadbir, but the kind of micromanaging of the future that so many people nowadays think they should be doing is, I think, very alien to the Islamic ethos, which is based on tawakkul.
Just to reiterate, if I haven't been loud enough, the people at the back, you can ask questions if you have any. So, anyone else? Yes, sorry. Yeah.
You're talking about hadiths that were related to animals. I was wondering how, just because it's interesting with hermeneutics,
Mm-hmm.
does that relate to halal meat?
Yeah.
What was the question?
It's about halal meat in the context of the principle of kindness to animals. The basic Muslim assumption is always that halal slaughter is the kindest form of slaughter. And in the context of modern industrial meat processing, sometimes a strong case has to be made to defend that. The pagan Arabs used to kill animals any way they felt like killing, including shooting arrows at them. The hadith clearly indicates that the knife should be sharpened, an animal shouldn't be slaughtered in the presence of other animals because that will frighten them. You shouldn't show the animal the knife, it should be done very quickly and by a competent person. So the process of halal slaughter is integrated into the idea that one should be kind to animals. Vegetarianism in the context of world religion can't be a maxim because in many places, including nomadic Arabia, there isn't really any possibility of growing anything. The only thing you've got in the desert is camels and sheep and goats, and if you make people vegetarian, you're going to have an empty desert. But still, the Prophet frequently wouldn't eat meat for an extended period. In the modern habit, very common in the Muslim world, of eating meat twice a day or 3 times a day is something that's actually against the Prophet. There's hadith which indicate that nothing was cooked in his house for several months in succession.
Can I ask another question? Just to speak on the other one. Used halal out of context. So he said, I can't remember what he was saying, but a action that he was thinking about doing. He said, well, that's a halal.
Yeah, halal doesn't mean meat that's slaughtered the correct way. Halal just means lawful. So lawful meat, but a lawful marriage, a lawful business transaction. It's a general adjective.
Okay, yep.
You talked about predetermination of some characteristics because of genetics. If there's any fraction of predetermination in characteristics, how does that affect the principle of justice, especially in the hereafter? So, for example, if someone's even fractionally predisposed to lying, how would then that affect the judgment?
Well, the presumption is then that is taken into account. Just as we take into account the particular strengths and weaknesses of children when figuring out how to punish them or to discipline them, you can see he's always doing that. He has that tendency, therefore we moderate our behaviour towards that child. The presumption is that the divine justice also takes any predispositions we might have into consideration.
Can I ask a slightly related question? So, at least when I was growing up, I learned that so there's certain characteristics for prayer leaders in Islam. And one of them is that a child who's born out of wedlock can never be a prayer leader. I don't know if you agree with this or not, but if you do agree with this, how does this then, for the child as an individual, how does justice apply here?
Well, it's not that the child is unworthy, it's that people may feel that their prayer is second-rate. There are, in many communities, deep hesitations about people who have been born out of wedlock, and it may well be that they feel that their prayer is being vitiated. And it's not just being a leader in prayer, it's being head of state, for instance. There's other areas in Sharia where people in that situation have to be disqualified. There are different fatwas nowadays that say that this is something that's historically conditioned and not actually binding, but that's the usual classical position. It doesn't affect the validity of that person's prayer as an individual.
Okay, yes.
I just want to ask you, why does God permit bad things to happen to good people? Like, why would someone just who hasn't done anything bad in their lives get killed in a car accident?
Yeah, this is one of the paradoxes of monotheism. God is ethically perfect, so why has he produced a world in which things happen that we can't see the sense of? Essentially, there's two classical theological responses to that. One is that we cannot meaningfully assess the divine mind because we have finite minds, and the divine mind is infinite, and therefore when we say, I wouldn't do that if I was God, it's an meaningless anthropomorphism. God is less personal in Islamic theology than in Christian theology, for instance. In Christian theology, God is the Father, God is the Son, God can have a body and be man like ourselves. So there's a genuine analogy that can be established between humanity and God. Islamic theology, God uses personal language of himself in a certain context in Scripture, but isn't a person, isn't considered to be a kind of consciousness akin to our own. So it's a kind of inappropriate question, and the Qur'an says he's not asked about what he does. Human beings will be asked. The other answer to that is that God is not just a God of love, but God has other names as well. God is loving, God is compassionate and merciful, but God has names that are more rigorous and scary. God is the creator of hell as well as of heaven. God is the creator of exploding galaxies and the rigorous stuff, the jalal stuff that happens in creation, and that's a reflection of his majesty. So the problem of evil exists in Islamic theology, but it's not quite such a problem as it is in a lot of, certainly Western Christian theology, where God is love, and it's difficult to imagine how a God of love could have made little babies die in agony when it's not their fault. Islamic theology, pretty ruthlessly, if you like, says it's God that's doing that. But that's part of the divine omnipotence and the divine majesty, and we just accept it. Sometimes in Christian theology they speak of the left and the right hand of God. God does with his right hand all of the things that we like, the things that we would do if we were God. With his left hand he creates epidemics and earthquakes, but it's still his doing. Blake's tiger is all about that. Did he who made the lamb make thee? He made the fluffy little lamb, we can relate to that. He made the tiger that eats the lamb. That's harder to understand, but his answer, of course, is yes, he did. God creates the difficult stuff in creation as well as the easy things.
Why the banking interest, sud is haram in Islam? And what is the adverse impact on the society?
Well, I think most people nowadays can see the potential dangers of an interest-based banking system where there's not just interest on the principal, but interest on the interest and hedge funds and futures, and it becomes a whole metaphysical world of conjuring money out of nothing, and everybody's suffering as a result. The basic Islamic presumption, which used to be the Christian presumption and is in Aristotle as well, is that you can't have a price on money. Interest as the price of money is an incoherent concept. Money is not a commodity, it's a measurement of the value of commodities. And therefore, Islamic civilization has historically been extremely successful as a mercantile culture while excluding the principle of interest-based banking. You can lend money, but you have to share in the risk of the enterprise that you're lending money to. So instead of, say, Barclays lending money to a new factory and knowing that if the factory fails, the underwriters, the insurers will pay, so they'll definitely get back their 10%. Instead, Barclays would invest on the assumption that they would get a certain proportion of the profits, a little bit like the way the merchant banks used to work. So it's not as if there is no alternative to the interest-based banking system. Islamic civilization was a brilliant mercantile culture for 1,000 years on the basis of an alternative model. Islamic banking is very successful now. It's capitalized at about $800 billion. Sometimes it looks a little bit like window dressing, but sometimes it's quite substantial. It's the only demonstrably successful alternative and ethically oriented model to Western interest-based banking. Nothing else seems to work.
Yes.
When you were talking about the relationship between the past and the present and the future, and the importance of living in the present and knowing the immediacy of the present moment and then acting within that. I suppose I wanted to sort of question the relationship between the past and the present insofar as it might actually be, in a way, the past is reconstructed in the present always through interpretation and through different books. And so in one important way, obviously the past cannot be changed in an empirical sense. The Berlin Wall fell when it did and so on.
Yeah.
But given that the only way we can know the past is through books or photographs, and these things might be falsified, you know, people might be brushed out of the photographs, then memory itself might be changed in the present moment. And so that relationship between the past and the present is actually slightly different. It's not just that the past cannot be changed, it might be subject to certain mediations in the present, which therefore changes the relationship between the past and the present.
I take it that the past itself can't be changed, but our perception of it can, and the degree of our accuracy can be changed. And one needs historians, one needs archaeologists, and that's a legitimate religious as well as secular concern. But you can't change what happened. Unless, of course, you believe in string theory, which I'm told that you might be able to. That's beyond me.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes. My question is regarding relation of Islam with present day, what is being alleged as religion of terrorism. Some people say, some people equate acts of violence in certain Muslim countries as if it's clash of civilization, sort of that. So I would request you to guide us about in what ways religion of Islam allows jihad and militant sort of perspective.
Well, jihad is not the same as a militant perspective. Jihad just means the use of proportional force, which exists in most cultures, just war doctrine. Terrorism is something else. Terrorism is the arbitrary targeting of the innocent in order to place pressure on governments, which is something that doesn't have origins in Islamic culture or ethics and comes out of the French Revolution and certain 19th century anarchist movements that use terrorism. Its adoption in the Muslim world is very recent and is an expression of westernization. But terrorism, 9/11 for instance, according to classical Islamic law, is classified as hiraba, which carries the death penalty. So there isn't really an issue. The problem is people in the West don't know who speaks for Islam, and in most cases they don't even think that they should ask. Islam has leaders and muftis and Islamic universities that issue declarations on these things, but everybody's very vague about what Muslims actually think. So they know about Abu Qatada or whoever, but they don't know what the Mufti of Egypt is saying about anything. It's pretty hopeless, really. But then Muslims can also misunderstand what's going on in the Christian world. I met somebody in Mali 4 years ago who was a bit out of touch, no broadband connection in Timbuktu. So he told me the leader of the Catholic Church is the Pope and the leader of Protestant Christianity is George Bush. That was his perception of the world and religion and violence and who leads the other religion. But really, it is the case that you can read the Times from cover to cover for a whole year and not be able to name a single Muslim leader. It's just not on the screens of the chattering classes in the West that they should tell people what Muslim leaders actually think about these issues. It's just not done.
Okay, any final questions? Yes, at the back.
Hi. You spoke a lot during your talk about the conflict perhaps between the secular Western values and some of the more traditional Islamic values. There are different ways some moral values are perceived because some can determine negativity, whereas you can't as secularists. I was just wondering to what extent you think you can be a fully functioning member of Western society while still adhering to those Muslim values?
It depends what you take membership of Western society to be. If it means you have to go to the pub and you have to listen to Whitney Houston and you mustn't wear hijab, it depends on how restrictive your definition is of being Western. But one of the positive things about Western civilization, one of the many positive things, is that there is a fairly broad spectrum of acceptable behaviours and attitudes and beliefs that are possible. You can be a full member of the University of Cambridge and be any religion and do eccentric things, if you like, compared to what some students get up to. What Muslim students do is actually pretty tame. Look at the Druids amongst the students, for instance, or those who go to the Isis temple in Cherry Hinton, and it's pretty kind of sober and down to earth. But in terms of being at ease with the underlying presuppositions of the modern world, I think all religionists are deeply uncomfortable, not just with the symptoms like environmental degradation, but with the causes of that, materialism, and the idea that material desires equal happiness, and a basically reductionist biological definition of what we are, and a pessimism about eternal life. We can't buy into those things. That doesn't mean we can't be fully part of society, but we have an alternative, in many ways quite a radical voice. But the intention should not be to get angry, but to try and help people and to try and heal people. This is a society which we consider to be spiritually, morally, economically unhealthy. If we believe that, then our proper response should be to try and help, not to just preach angrily about its evils, but to see what we can do to help people.
Yes?
You mentioned that in the time of the Prophet himself was a source of charisma, so that the people around him could internalize these ethics and then implement them later on. So in our day and age today, where is that charisma going to come from?
Religious charisma is given to people who are successful in being what God wants them to be, what they're made to be, the greatness which everybody has as a possibility. Anybody can be a saint, anybody can be a perfected human being. There is a possible you that is there that you need to grow into, that you need to fill, rather than your existing kind of conflicted self. And there are such people, and to the extent that people overcome the ego and live for God and live for others and see the beauty in the world and around themselves, then they're charismatic and people are transformed by them. Charismatic doesn't just mean that you give extremely loud khutbahs or you have strong views on Kashmir. Charismatic means that even if you're not saying anything, people are changed by you. The Sheikhs say, "Man la yufiduka lahzo, la yufiduka lafzo." Whoever's glance doesn't change you, his words won't change you either. And the successful, miraculous transformation that the Prophet brought about amongst his very rough people was the fact that he would look at them and they'd change. He looked at the camel running amok and the camel calmed down. But he didn't speak loudly to it. Unfortunately, Muslims nowadays often think that charisma means being very loud and angry and gesticulating and doing outrageous things. That's not charisma. That in most cases that's the turbulence of the lower self, the fire of anger expressing itself. It's closer to the ethos of Jahiliyyah than to the serene masterfulness of prophetic Islam.
Yes, you.
You spoke about adorning ourselves with God's character. How is it possible to practically show about doing this?
Well, Al-Ghazali has a book, Al-Maqsad al-Asna, which is in English, and obviously it's 900 years old and things have changed, but what he does is to go through the 99 names of God, explaining what they mean, and then explaining how we might adopt that quality. How can we be merciful? How can we be just? How can we be mild? Some of them we can't really, like Al-Mumit. God is the one who brings death. How are we supposed to adorn ourselves with that exactly, unless we're at the front line in a battle situation? There are certain names that are to do with the divine rigour that are not necessarily for us to emulate exactly, but Al-Ghazali explains how we can benefit from those things. But it is an important practice, and the hadith says God has 99 names, 100 minus 1. Man ahsaha dakhala al-jannah. Whoever enumerates them will enter paradise. And that doesn't mean you just get out your tasbih and you go through the 99 and you're sorted. It means that you meditate upon them and you recognize that these are forms of perfection, and you allow yourself to be adjusted accordingly. And they're all universal, none of them are out of date. Virtues never go out of date.